Chances are you will hear a lot about Jesus in the coming week, here in this church or anywhere else, for that matter, that you regularly go, because so many people are marking the beginning of what's referred to as Holy Week. Today with Palm Sunday, the coming of Maundy Thursday, Good Friday, and the telling of the death of the teacher Jesus, and Easter, a story of new life. We read today was the beginning of, in my experience, the central teachings of that teacher Jesus, the Sermon on the Mount, the Beatitudes that begin that. And one of the primary memories I have, the images that comes to my mind of the Sermon on the Mount, isn't from the Christian churches I grew up in. The image that sticks with me the most often, to be honest, is from the Wax Museum in Grand Prairie. When you go to the Wax Museum in Grand Prairie, where I went a lot as a child, somewhere in between Clark Gable and Mother Teresa is an exhibit of the life of Jesus. And you walk through this really vast exhibit. It takes up a lot of space in this place devoted to the chapters in the life of the teacher Jesus. From the infancy narratives and the nativity to the young man teaching at the temple. And in the center, before you get to the crucifixion and the resurrection part of the story, there's a large space where they've cut out into plastic or plaster rock places for you to sit on the mount. And there is a fixed wax Jesus with a speaker, and it's playing the Sermon on the Mount over and over and over again. And I remember as a kid that this was actually a really meaningful place for me. This was a very important story to me growing up, and I would go with my family or on a school trip or all these different reasons to go, and we'd kind of sit on the rock and listen. As an adult, the whole thing seems a little strange to me. Here's this image of the teacher Jesus who looks very typical in the way that American expressions of this teacher are. He's, I think, a light-skinned, blue-eyed guy in this representation, not what he would have looked like in his day, of course. But what stands out to me is that this is the image of that story that is so present when I remember it, and yet the story of the Sermon on the Mount and the central teachings of Jesus are anything but fixed in stone. This is not meant to be a status quo support of our culture's values on repeat. As an adult, I understand the Sermon on the Mount and the central teachings of the teacher Jesus to be a call to a radical shift in perspective, both in what our culture thinks is important and who our culture thinks is important, and also a call for us to cultivate the kind of eyes where we see the presence of God in the poor, the sick. In his day, he said, in criminals and tax collectors and prostitutes and those who society deemed as outcast. The story of Palm Sunday is exactly that kind of role reversal and flipping traditional norms on their heads. Here, dirt poor peasants are gathering in celebration, laying their cloaks on the ground in palms, celebrating and calling a man king who is a homeless, self-appointed rabbi who's about to be put to death. A man who was going around to disaffected, dirt-poor peasants in occupied territory and saying, "Don't listen to what anybody tells you. You're a child of God." And yet the image in my mind of that Sermon on the Mount is as fixed as it could be. I think we forget that the central teachings of the Jesus story are about things being turned on their heads, about cultivating the kind of eyes that would see the beloved community as tiny as a mustard seed. The parable that he tells in the Sermon on the Mount goes on to those traditional things that you've heard before and we become so familiar with. The teaching that if someone strikes you, you turn the other cheek. that our spiritual lives won't be measured by whether we kill or rob or give, but on our interior judgments of others. The notion that if someone forces you to walk a mile, you walk two. All of those things which in the day were turning cultural values on top of one another and are not our images of power or wisdom or authority today either. And I think that because we live in a society that identifies as Christian and tells this story so much, we can often forget how revolutionary that change in perspective looks. I think that religion, one of the good things that a religious community can do over the years of our life, is to help us practice week after week gaining that new perspective. Asking ourselves, what is taking up space in my life and what deserves to take up space in my life? And Lent, this period of 6 weeks leading up to the Easter story, is a really good time to do that as well. As Daniel said so well last week, what Lent does is ask us to be very honest about the fact that our lives will one day end. That the fact that all of us in the room will meet the end of our life changes things. The period of Lent asks us to admit the space and size of our lives and that it's limited, and to ask what can or should fit in to these limited days. Now, I know that in my life there are plenty of things I wish I experienced in different proportion. I know that, and maybe you do this too, I'm assuming that most people do, I can get myself worked up about a moment or a difficult conversation, a person that I do not want to talk to, a conversation that I don't want to have, and weeks leading up to it. I feed this thing, and I feed this thing, and I feed this thing until it becomes this monster in my mind, huge. And then I get there, and it's nowhere near as big and monstrous as it was in my mind. For the hours and hours I have spent in my life protecting my ego, or worried about how I would be perceived, or worried that I looked intelligent or capable, or worried that I would be right. How many days have literally been spent taking up that space in my life, making sure those things are taken care of? And as the parent of a young child, I'm increasingly aware of how many little, ordinary, mundane moments that are so important that I just pass right by. I recognize that so much of our living is treating the things that really matter like they don't, and the things that don't like they do. It's not all that complicated, really. And that's really why I think the story that we read from Jill Bolte Taylor this morning is such a Lenten one. She did not ask for this change in perspective, but she got it. And I think that it's a Lenten change in perspective because she got this radical shift in what was important in her life at the very edge of her mortality. Here's this woman who knows the workings of the brain inside out. And she's watching the functioning of her mind deteriorate before her eyes. Her brain's dying, in a sense. She talks about it in terms of size. She says, I stopped being able to tell where my body ended and the wall began. She says she felt enormous and expansive. Now, this is not an insight that we would wish on anybody in the way that she received it. It was painful and dangerous, and the kind of experience that she went through is incredibly debilitating or life-threatening for many people. She says when she woke up, she was surprised that she was still alive, and I love that part. Stands out to me so much. She said, I never thought I could fit the enormity of who I was back into this little body. She says she could never live the same after she felt that change in size and perspective. That it changed the way she felt about human connection and compassion, our relations together. And one of the things I love is that she said it's not something external to us. That this experience of knowing in a concrete way that we are innately, intimately connected to one another is in us all the time. That each of us can move to that part of ourselves and experience it. I had my own moment of a shift in insight a year ago, nowhere near as profound as hers or as shocking. But this shift in perspective for me, I come back to in moments when I'm overwhelmed and life feels out of control for me, or I feel too much self-importance. And it happened with our communications director, Fritz Kuhn, who I'm guessing is up in the booth somewhere. Fritz and I were both in our offices at the end of the day, and for some reason or another, about a year ago, we were both having a really hard day at work for different reasons. And I can't remember why I was having a really hard day at work now, but I know I was at the end of my rope, and I was frustrated, and I heard Fritz sigh from his office and went over to check on him, and he was in the same place that I was. And there was just that kind of constriction, that feeling in the day. And I went over because I needed to get materials for a memorial service, some supplies that we use in memorial services or scattering of ashes. And I went and I found the bag that we often use to hold the cremated remains that we scatter with friends and family of loved ones. As I was carrying it back to the office, I noticed that after we had emptied the ashes the last time we'd used it, a small amount had sifted to the bottom corner of the pocket, in the corner of the bag. Just this tiny amount. I found myself wondering if that had happened in the last time that we had scattered ashes with a family, or whether this tiny amount represented a few ceremonies. I carried this bag of ashes back with me, and I think Fritz and I were the last people at the office, because he's the only person that I can remember was there that day. And I said, "Hey, do you want to go to the memorial garden with me?" We went out, and both of us were still kind of in the midst of our upset day. And we went and we kneeled in the dirt in the garden and prayed over those ashes of someone that we had loved, or someone that we loved had loved. And I remember when the feeling of the dust and the ash and the bone was moving through my fingers into the dirt. What a remarkable shift there was. Like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders, like the clouds had parted, like a breath of fresh air, all of those cliche things. I remember, not like Jill Bolte Taylor feeling big, I remember how small I felt in that moment. And that was a good thing. I cannot remember what we were so upset about that day. But I do remember what a shift in perspective it meant to kneel in the dirt with the dust and the ash. The ash for Ash Wednesday in churches created by burning and blessing the palms from Palm Sunday each year. And knowing that the meaning of my life had something to do with the fact that it would end. In the scope of the history of the universe, in that perspective, we are like the snap of a finger, the blink of an eye. If you took the entire history of the cosmos and made it one calendar year, humans show up in the last 2 minutes. And yet, in the scope of one human life, in a moment like laying the ashes into the ground, I remembered that there's all these tiny moments in my life that are numbered. How many more Sundays do we have together? Chances are, if all of us live an average lifespan, we can estimate how many. There will be a last time that I give my son a bath. There will be a last time that you kiss someone or hear the words, "I love you." There will be a last time that we are held or that we express kindness to someone else. All of these tiny things that we pass over day to day seem so big in that lens. I think this is one of the reasons why we come back to a congregation like ours week after week, to remember that. Sometimes we get it in the crazy teachings of a self-appointed rabbi riding into town, preaching that the poor are blessed, that those who suffer are blessed, that those who are meek and peacemakers are blessed, not the message that we get often from our culture. Sometimes we're reminded of that radical shift in our perspective because we have a close call with life or death, or sometimes tragedy strikes. And we're reminded that the human care we have in these limited years is what matters. But for me, even in those extreme moments, it's hard for me to maintain that perspective. I get it when my fingers are in the ash, or I get it when that phone call comes in the middle of the night, but day to day, I forget. And I think for me, it's not one snap of the finger and my life has changed. For me, gaining that perspective takes years and years of practice. I think the spiritual discipline of gaining perspective, allowing the big things to be big and the small things to be small, is had in marking our days. That's why we come each week and sing songs and pray and look into the faces of the people around us and watch as the names of those who are born are read and those who have died are read. I think that's why we celebrate and mark Lent. As Daniel has said a lot of times, he thinks Ash Wednesday is one of the most Unitarian Universalist holidays of the year because it's an acknowledgement that we have this one go-round to make the best use of it. I think for me, the spiritual discipline of perspective also, though, looks like paying attention to those moments in my life where things do feel extreme, the thin edges of my days. In my experience, when I am very frustrated or very happy, incredibly nervous or grieving, when life feels extreme, usually in my life that means I'm either giving a lot of space to exactly the right things, and that's why I'm frustrated, or I'm giving a lot of space to exactly the wrong things, and that's why I'm frustrated. I think the spiritual discipline of gaining perspective means paying attention to those moments and knowing they're a good indicator of what we're giving size to and space for in our lives. We only have 1 week left in Lent. But maybe just for those remaining days, you pick 2 things. Something that you wish didn't take up as much space in your life, and something that you wish took up a lot more space in your life. And risk, just for the next 6 or 7 days, living as if those changes were true. What I see in all these stories is good news. If dirt-poor peasants in occupied territory can find life's meaning in the teachers who are going to be executed within a few days' time, if this brain scientist can find something of our human connection and life's meaning while her brain isn't working, then the chance that you and I, over the course of our days, can gain a little new perspective are pretty good with practice. The fact is, it is never too late in our lives to fill our remaining days up with the biggest things. As Daniel's sermon last week reminded us, we only have so many opportunities to go around the sun together in these bodies. And we hope that what our church can do of the many things is help us to practice realizing what we want to fit into those precious few days. May this week and the remaining days of Lent be a reminder that we are called to practice using these precious and beautiful and few days of our lives very well. Many blessings to you, friends, and may your perspectives be full and good and wise. Amen.